Good evening. I'm Deborah Yedlin, and I've been covering the energy sector as a journalist since 1996. My first real introduction to the energy sector in the oil sands actually came at a Suncor due diligence session in 1991. I was at Richardson Greenshields at the time, and we were part of the underwriting group for the IPO. The entire day's session was focused on operations risk, financial risk, commodity price risk, economic risk. Not much was said or asked about environmental risks or liabilities. That wouldn't be the case today. These days, if you're in the energy business, you're in the environmental business. But not everyone realizes that. What fascinates me is the lack of understanding of the everyday connection of life and energy. Last week, I participated in a CBC panel linking Alberta and Nebraska. The topic, not surprising, was energy and the Keystone Pipeline. One of the questions posed was, what did the pipelines mean for Alberta? And a woman describing herself as a retired teacher stood up and said it had caused huge income disparity in the province and made it a very expensive place to live. I responded with a question. So, you're a retired teacher. Where do you think the money came from to pay your salary? And what about the pension you enjoy that maintains your retired lifestyle? She proceeded to call me an apologist for the energy sector. I prefer to see myself as an economist and lapsed investment banker using that background to connect the dots on energy, markets, and the environment. But the retired teacher exemplified what I call the energy disconnect. Maybe I'm not doing my job so well. Everything every one of us does and has done has been supported by energy. Coal, oil, natural gas, some hydro, maybe some wood. But we ignore the fact that we are a disposable society that values convenience and comfort, with that lifestyle underwritten primarily by hydrocarbons. Instead of making the connection between energy and daily life, jobs, the economy, we have a scapegoat. It's the energy sector's fault that greenhouse gas emissions are increasing. But the oil sands account for 0.1% of global emissions. Stop producing today, and it makes no difference. How many of us in this room grew up with apples, oranges, boring fruits and vegetables in the grocery store through the winter months? Mandarin oranges were the big treat, arriving sometime around Grey Cup. Last week, during the CBC panel, the Sierra Club's representative kept referring to renewable energy as the answer to decreasing dependence on hydrocarbons. There's never been a wind spill, he said, but that's not realistic. Last I checked, you still need 1 kilowatt hour of baseload power for every kilowatt hour of renewable power. Last I checked, planes don't fly on electric power. Trucks don't run on electricity, at least not yet, nor do ships or freight trains, all elements of a global supply chain that keeps the economy moving, not to mention puts fresh raspberries in the grocery aisle through the winter months. Like it or not, the energy density of gasoline or diesel has yet to be surpassed. And electric cars, as long as the power is generated by coal, it's a false economy. We need to be realistic. A study for the Center of Global Development showed that $10 billion invested in renewable power in Africa would impact 20 million people. But take that same amount of money and invest it on gas-fired power, and you impact 90 million people. Do you think someone in the developing world without power or clean water cares about renewable power? Hell no. Last week, the UN Secretary General said he wanted climate change to be a top priority for world governments. But a UN-sponsored survey showed that people around the world are more concerned about education, healthcare, jobs, and affordable food. Global warming was last on the list at number 17. It makes sense that the newly elected Prime Minister of India promised that every village in India will have electricity within the next 5 years. Think about that the next time you flick on the lights. This is about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, writ large. So let's talk about that energy disconnect. The Hollywood types whose carbon footprint is inconsistent with the message they purport to deliver. The pipeline protesters who fly to protests or Neil Young concerts without connecting the dots on how the fuel got to the plane in the first place. Or the guy that I encountered at a Starbucks one morning last February. I parked behind a car and it was idling. And I walked into the Starbucks and there was one man standing there and I asked him, "Is that your car?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "My kids would call you an environmental terrorist." And he said, "Why is that?" I said, "Because you're in here, your car's running, we're not in Iqaluit, and it's not minus 50 degrees. And he looked at me and said, "But it doesn't matter. It's a hybrid." I'm not saying we don't have to think about energy in a sustainable context. We do. But it has to be well-informed and civil. As former Suncor CEO Rick George said, it's time for an adult conversation on energy use and development. Time to stop talking past one another. Time to acknowledge we are part of the problem and part of the solution. Time for markets to have more patience for the time involved in meeting regulatory requirements. Time for energy companies to spend more on research and development and less on share buybacks. Time to recognize, as the Indian Prime Minister said this week, that economic development and the climate are not enemies. After all, if we can put a man on the moon with the amount of computing power that sits in everyone's cell phones today, we can figure out the path to energy sustainability that is honest and works for everyone. Thank you.